We are in the third week of a sermon series titled Risky Business. This sermon series will be 4 weeks. Next week we're going to take a week off. I'm going to be away from the church. Father Ryan, who many of you know, will be leading us in communion. He is particularly skilled and I think passionate about doing a liturgical style of communion. And so I hope that you'll come for that. And then he's going to preach. And so it'll be good to have him here. This series has been about risk because life is about the business of risk. And one of the foundational statements of the series is simply that the life we make is determined by the risks that we take. If you were to tell your life story, a way to tell your life story is to talk about the various risks that you've taken in your life. Maybe you took the risk to get married. Maybe you took the risk to have kids or adopt kids, and that was life-changing, wasn't it? Maybe you took the risk that you went off to school and you thought that that was going to benefit you, and maybe it has, but you got this debt and it feels still quite a bit risky. There's all sorts of risks that we take in our lives, some good ones, some bad ones, some are planned, some are unplanned, but the life that we make is truly determined by the risks that we take. As a pastor and a follower of Jesus, I would say that perhaps the most profound risk that you should consider taking is the risk to follow Jesus. And it is risky to follow Jesus because Jesus, he says things like this. He says, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Now, I don't know about you, but I tend to like to say yes to myself. I tend to be drawn to the things that I enjoy, the things that bring me comfort. And when there's something that I want to do, I like to say yes to that. And when there's something I don't want to do, I tend to say no. And if there's suffering involved, I try to avoid that. Yet Jesus, he's saying, if you want to come follow me, there's going to be a certain amount of saying no to yourself, saying no to your personal preferences, saying no to what feels comfortable and convenient at the moment. And that you're indeed actually going to walk towards some forms of suffering. And in the end of the day, he's saying that this is going to serve you the best. But it feels a bit risky to me, because in the moment, saying no to myself and walking towards the suffering, boy, that sounds like suffering. Feels like a risk. But Jesus goes on to say, he says, all who want to save their lives will lose them. He's saying, listen, there's a risk in not taking on his perspective. Those who make their lives all about preserving their personal preferences, it's all about them, they end up losing something. I bet you've never met a truly happy, self-centered, selfish person. I mean, on the surface, they seem kind of happy, right? But if you really get to know them down deep, there's something really, really rough going on. And this is Jesus' way of saying that all those who live a self-centered life end up losing it all in the end. However, those who lose their lives because of me, it's not sacrifice just for sacrifice's sake, but those who lose their lives for a bigger purpose will indeed find them. And it's a gamble. It's a risk. But he's saying, come follow me and see the world in the way that I see it and be in the world in the way that I showed how to be in it, and this will pay off in the end. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like this. Fishing. Fishing. In the first message of this series, we encountered 2 fishermen, and Jesus came to these fishermen and he gave them an invitation to stop fishing for fish, but to begin to fish for people. Their lives were about just making a living, and that's okay, but Jesus invited them to something much, much bigger, to fish for people, to reach people, for their lives to be other-oriented. And what were they to do when they actually caught some people? Well, it was to provide some hope to the hopeless. It was to provide some meaning to the meaningless. Because life can be really difficult. It's easy to lose hope. It's easy to find yourself in situations where it just doesn't seem like there's any meaning or any purpose to this work that I'm doing or this thing that I must get through. But we, as followers of Christ, are to bring hope to the hopeless. There is reason to believe that things could get better. There's reason for hope. And there's meaning right here and right now. You don't need to go somewhere else. God has purpose in your life. We're to bring courage to the cowards because it's so easy for all of us to be afraid. But Jesus says over and over again, you do not need to fear. And finally, we're to bring grace to the undeserving. And do you know who the undeserving are? Us. Because grace is undeserved favor. It is something that is a gift. And if you're not undeserving, you're not a candidate for grace. And I know it's offensive. And it's scandalous. But the good news, the game changer that changes our hearts and that can change the world is the good news of God's grace and God's favor, God's welcome, God's love, God's welcome into heaven is all based on his grace. You can't earn it. You can't win it. You can only receive it. And it's a gamble. It's a risk because so much of the world does not work this way. But Jesus comes and he says, let me tell you what God is really like. And we all have a choice. And it's risky to follow Jesus. It's risky to believe what he has to say. But Jesus was also telling you that it's risky not to follow. And last week, we looked at the story of somebody that came so close to following Jesus. He is a person that had lived his life according to the laws and the rules, and he'd done a good job. But there was something standing in his way. And that story is in Matthew 16. And this man, he passed on the invitation to follow Jesus because he ended up being too possessed by his possessions. And often, the last thing that people begin to loosen up their grip on when they become disciples is their money and their possessions. It's so easy to become possessed by the things that we own. And we believe that it's all for our consumption, that everything that comes our way is meant to be for us. And money and wealth is not a bad thing. The risk is underestimating the risk that money and wealth can have for capturing your heart. And this guy got really close, but he passed on it. And I think that if we were to be honest, I know that this is true about me, that many of us, we care more about our bank account than the account we will have to give for what we've been given. And I've already told you that it is by grace that we are received into heaven, that God is a God of grace. This is not about your eternal life. But if you follow the teachings of Jesus, there is definitely a suggestion that you have been given a gift, you've been given some time, and that at some point in time, there will be an account of what you've done with the talent and the money and the time that you've been given. I'm going to take you to Matthew 25, where Jesus tells one of these stories to look at this dynamic. But before we do that,
Nerd alert!
we got a nerd alert. So I just want to break down a little bit of Matthew because the gospel is so amazing. There are 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. The gospel of Matthew has 28 chapters, and the first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters, they make a very distinctive introduction and conclusion. And then you start to get these middle sections. Go ahead, Josh. You get 5 middle sections, and it's very intentional. And the 5 middle sections, what they are trying to communicate, what they are mimicking, is the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses, go back. The first 5 books, where you get the foundational stories. And Matthew, he is very intentional about doing this callback to this ancient literature as a way to say that Jesus, like Moses, is coming to bring something new, an instruction that is going to form a group of people. Matthew is so masterful. And then we get to the 26th chapter where it all goes down. You got to read the 26th chapter of Matthew. It is unbelievable. In the 26th chapter of Matthew, this is where you get the Last Supper. that we celebrate once a month here, where Jesus gives his final instructions to his disciples, and better yet, he announces the new covenant, the new arrangement between God and humanity that is based not on what you do and how you've earned your way in, but based on God's grace alone. And then there's Judas. Nobody names your kids Judas. I don't know why. There's Judas who betrays Jesus. One day I'm going to get a cat. I'm going to name him Judas, and I'm just going to get a nasty cat and call him Judas. He's going to scratch me and all that. Okay, Judas. Nobody has a son named Judas, but maybe a cat. You get Judas, and he betrays him, and Jesus gets arrested, and it's just all this energy, and eventually Jesus, he's headed towards the cross. It's the climax of this masterful account of the life of Jesus. Right beforehand in chapter 25, Jesus has a string of teachings, and the purpose of these teachings are all about preparation, all about urgency, because it's all about to go down. And so Jesus tells a story about these bridesmaids, and then a story about the judgment of the nations. And right smack in the middle is the story we're going to look at, which is the parable of the coins. It's amazing. You got to read Matthew. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who was leaving on a trip. He called his servants and handed his possessions over to them. To one he gave 5 valuable coins, to another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1. He gave to each servant according to that servant's ability. Then he left on a journey. And this highlights a very simple lesson I'm trying to teach my daughter, which is life is not fair. One gets 5 coins, one gets 2 coins, one gets 1 coin, and they're given according to their ability. And that's the way life works. After the man left, the servant who had 5 valuable coins took them, went to work doing business with them, and gained 5 more. I'm going to put these coins into play. I'm going to do some trade. And he's successful. In the same way, the one who had 2 valuable coins gained 2 more. And we learned something quite simple about success. That success takes work and risk. He took the master's money and he did something with it. And he worked and put effort, but he also took a risk. Both of these guys, and it worked out for them. There was no guarantee, but luckily it did for them. Now, the servant who received the 1 valuable coin dug a hole in the ground, as I guess you do back then, and buried his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The guy that had 5 comes and says, "Hey, I doubled your money." And the master says, "Excellent, you are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me." The guy that had 2 coins, who doubled that money, he comes and says, "Here you go, I've doubled your money." And the master says, "Well done, you're a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little things. Guess what? I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me." Now, you all know what's coming? The old 1 coin. Yeah, not going to be good. Now, the one who had received 1 valuable coin came and said, what do you think he said? Maybe he said, "Master, I didn't know how to invest your money, so I hid it. I just didn't have the knowledge. I didn't know what to do. The other guys, they're equipped, but I just didn't know, so I hid it." Taking some ownership, taking some responsibility. Maybe he would have said, "Master, hey, I got scared and I lost my nerve. It was too big of a risk for me, and I was a little bit afraid, and they were all doing really well with the money they had, and I just lost my nerve, so I hid the money and did nothing with it." Not the best answer, but forgivable. Here's what he really says. "Master, I knew that you are a hard man. Before we talk about what I did with your money, we need to first have a conversation about you and the problems you have, because this really isn't about me and what I didn't do with the money and the holes that I dug. It's really about you. Let me tell you about you. You harvest grain where you haven't sown. You gather crops where you haven't spread seed. You are really irresponsible. Let's talk about you before you talk about me. And because you are who you are, I was afraid. It's your fault. And therefore I hid the valuable coin in the ground. Here, have what's yours. I never wanted it anyways. Now, I think it's best to try to believe the best about people. So I'm trying to believe that this guy, despite his response, actually understood that he had missed an opportunity. And it was because of his unwillingness to take the responsibility to seize that opportunity that he returned with nothing. And therefore, he felt something that we all feel when we miss an opportunity, which is shame. And it's not a good feeling, but it's a real feeling. And in your life, if you've missed an opportunity to help someone or to make a move or get educated or just do something positive, we've all had it. We feel this very natural human emotion called shame. And I believe that if you haven't heard the good news that God sees you as you are and loves you just as you are, despite what you haven't done or the things you have done, that when you encounter that emotion of shame, it is really, really hard to deal with it. So you do what many people do. Those who feel shame often cast blame. And the people in your life that are casting the most blame, odds are, somewhere buried down deep is a whole lot of shame. And they need to hear the good news about how God loves them, but there's a big wall up. This is real. This is difficult. I want to talk to just the church people for a moment. Those of you that have decided and took the risk to be a follower of Jesus and therefore are part of his church. The church is not a building. It's not a place you go to. It's a gathering of people. It's a movement of hope and grace and love in this world. I want to talk to you. You might be aware that there's been a 60-year decline in religion in America, that many churches have been on a decline, that many churches have closed. It's not just Protestant churches, it's not just Catholic churches, it's not just Christianity, but within Christianity, there has been a dramatic and historic decline. And this is really difficult and really hard for those of us who love the church to deal with. And the question becomes, who's to blame? And I'm in some of these circles. I've had these conversations, and there's a lot of reasons that are put forth. Some of my favorite is probably Sunday soccer. Sunday soccer. If we just didn't have soccer on Sundays or kids' activities, then the church would be filled up. And my response to that is that the church just needs to be better than Sunday soccer. There's nothing wrong with Sunday soccer, but many times, as comparison, Sunday soccer programs are building more community and have more uplift going on than some churches. Sometimes it's secular culture. It's MTV, if that's still a thing. It was when I was younger. MTV and rock and roll and hippies and hipsters and people who are wearing the wrong things and singing in the wrong way. And it's just, and it's all that. And kids these days, have you met millennials? Oh my gosh. But that's not true. We've looked at some of the research. Young people are as spiritual as any generation. They've walked away from the church, but they haven't walked away from God. Or how about this one? Everyone's declining. Everyone's declining. Even the evangelicals are declining. Even those big churches are declining. And there's some truth to that, but I don't know. I drive by some churches that have humongous parking lots, and those things are full. And there's this thing, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's ridiculous. Some churches, they're so full that they open up another church and then they just send the video to that other church. And people actually go and just watch somebody on a screen. Who would do that? Lots of people, turns out. So who's to blame? And you might notice that in all of these, it's like the guy with the one coin. It was somebody else's fault and no willingness to look at oneself. Jesus says, all who want to save their lives will lose them. And I think, and what I have observed, is that in church life especially, but this plays out for us as individuals, that it is having to have it our way, the way we've always done it, that causes us to lose it all. I don't know if you've ever read the Gospels. One thing I've noticed, having read the Gospels, never does Jesus get in an argument about the type of music during worship. Yet many churches are divided over this. Never is there an argument about the order of worship that Jesus has with anybody. Yet churches cling to these things as if they are the sacred thing. Churches have declined because they prioritize their preferred methods over Christ's mission. And those methods served the church well for a season. And that is to be praised. But when the methods become the preference, we begin to risk Christ's mission. Put it another way, churches will either risk changing their methods or risk missing Christ's mission. Let me go ahead and have a spoiler alert here. The way we're doing church right now is not the way that we will likely do it in a year or 5 years or 10 years. Because the world is changing, and so therefore the methods should change. And what I've noticed by looking at those churches that are sending the video on screens and that sort of thing, there's some theology and other parts of that are not for me, but what I have noticed is they've been incredibly innovative and willing to change their methods. There's a lot of good to learn. They don't change the mission, but the methods. It's about becoming more open-handed and more focused on what is most important: fishing for people, spreading hope, encouraging courage, witnessing to God's grace. Back to the story. His master replied, "You evil and lazy servant." Pretty rough. Next one. "You knew that I harvest grain where I haven't sown and that I gather crops where I haven't spread seed." I think he's speaking sarcastically here. "In that case, you should have turned my money over to the bankers so that when I returned, you could give me what belonged to me with interest." You knew something to do. There was options. Yet you took the risk and did nothing. "Therefore, take from him the valuable coin and give it to the one who has 10 coins. Those who have much will receive more, and they will have more than they need. But as for those who don't have much, even the little bit they have will be taken away from them." And every time a church community closes, it grieves my heart. "Now take that worthless servant and throw him outside into the darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth." Sometimes Jesus doesn't feel so warm and fluffy, right? And we think that, is he talking about they're going to go to hell? No. We've already discussed the fact that it is by God's grace that we're welcomed into heaven. But when you pass an opportunity, the opportunity is passed. And there's a window of opportunity in our lives. And it doesn't mean that God has left us or forsaked us, but there's a window of opportunity to do things. And when we miss that opportunity, there's weeping and grinding of teeth. There's sadness, and often there's anger. And sometimes we project that anger onto others, but it's oftentimes anger at ourselves. And when your time is up, I believe you will give an account. And it won't be the basis on whether or not you get into heaven. That will be based on your ability to receive the good news of God's grace. Can you take the gift? But it seems to be clear from Jesus' teaching that at some point in time, we will give an account for what we've done with the time that we've had, the opportunities that were presented to us, the money, the talent, the effort that we had in front of us, and whether or not we took that opportunity. And I would say the most dangerous risk you can take is to take no risks at all. Sometimes you just got to get out there and try things. Few weeks, we're going to have a congregational meeting here at the church. Everybody's invited to stay. Members will vote on some things. We'll vote on a new governing board member. We'll vote on some updates to our bylaws, so some just really fun stuff, right? And we'll have our budget. And our church has been in a 16, 17-year historic deficit, and we're working our way out of it. But this year again, we're going to put forth a budget that is going to be a deficit budget. And we're going to ask again for some strategic spending. Because there's many of us in the leadership that feel that we're in a window of opportunity. One of the reasons we feel strongly about that is the growth we've seen in our worship. Last year we averaged 74 people on a Sunday. This year we're averaging 88. That's 16, 17% growth. A lot of people who were not connected with the church, had somewhat even given up on religion, have begun to get connected here. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we brought Jason on and we took a risk with our music. And so this is a time for us. And those of you that are members, you'll have the opportunity to either take that risk or not. So what risks should you take as individuals? Let me just suggest a couple, and then we'll close in prayer. The first one is to grow spiritually. You might actually take the risk to commit to yourself to be here every Sunday that you can be, to watch the messages that you've missed, or find some other preacher you connect with, to begin a devotional or start reading a book, or just participate in something. It's never been easier to grow in your knowledge of the Bible. There's the Bible Project. There's the Bible app. There's ways to grow spiritually. And if you do, it's risky because it will change you. You might take the risk to contribute financially. Maybe here, maybe somewhere else. But the barrier that often stands in the way of people's spiritual growth is the financial barrier. To begin to part with a little bit of that money because we all feel like we don't have enough. But Jesus says, where your treasure is, your heart will be. The money is the greatest competitor for our hearts, that there's a real risk and danger there. And the way that you combat that is you give somewhere. It could be here, it could be somewhere else, but that you are involved financially. You might become generous relationally. Some of you are stuck in negative relationships with people, and maybe you just need to become generous and look at that person with compassion and just change that dynamic. Or finally, you just might commit and take the risk to changing courageously. Because here's the thing, you're changing. You're changing. We're all changing all the time, but some of us, we fight tooth and nail against change. Others get in front of the change and realize that there's seasons of life, and sometimes they come to a close, and it's time to take the risk for something new. It's risky to follow Jesus. I think that he'll lead you out of your comfort zone. But it's also risky not to follow. Because when the opportunity is past, it is past. And those that miss the opportunity and fail to live into their potential because they were afraid to take the risk, often there's weeping and grinding of teeth. I don't want that for you or for myself. Let us pray. Gracious Lord, we thank you for the example of Jesus and his teachings that are sometimes bring peace to us, and other times, Lord, they unnerve us. And today's teaching, Lord, is all about developing a sense of urgency to not miss the opportunities that are in front of us as a church community and as individual disciples. So God, I pray that there would be courage among us to take the right risks, the risks that you're calling us to. In Christ's name.